Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Aubrey Reeves, CEO of Business and Arts. Before we begin, I'd first like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm a white settler speaking to you from Takaranto. I have the honor to be a guest on the traditional lands and waters of the Petun and Wendat peoples and the Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee confederacies, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River, as well as many other Indigenous nations, some of whose names are no longer remembered. We acknowledge all those who came before us and have traveled the lands and waters of this territory. We're grateful to have the opportunity to work, to live, and to meet on this territory. In light of recent events, many settlers are taking the time to listen, to learn, and to reflect on the meaning of reconciliation and what it demands of us. Let it compel all of us to move beyond words of acknowledgement and into actions that will right wrongs, to commit to learning the history of the genocide, displacement, and theft of land from Indigenous nations, and to continuously decolonize frameworks and roles that were imposed upon Indigenous peoples. We're reminded that colonization is not just a part of long ago history, but continues to impact and shape communities and our day-to-day work. In particular, I welcome everyone to consider thinking about decolonization practices as it relates to today's topic of governance. Together, we are diving into the first report in Mass Culture's The Future of Arts Work project, called Board Governance in the Arts, Emerging Ideas. Mass Culture is an arts support organization that is dedicated to recognizing and undertaking professional research that is relevant to the Canadian arts community. The Future of Arts Work project seeks to explore what the best approaches are for Canadian arts and culture organizations to structure their human systems and people strategies to respond to the current climate. The project is conducted in partnership with LeSage Arts Management and is funded by the Canada Council for the Arts. Mass Culture will also be presenting an interactive follow-up workshop in January. Details will be provided in the chat box. We are joined today by the report's co-authors, Jeanne LeSage and Shawn Newman. The session will be moderated by Future of Artwork advisor, Owais Lightwala. So let me tell everyone a little bit about our guests. Shawn Newman is a consultant, writer, and cultural producer based in Toronto, formerly the executive director of Public Access and managing editor of Public Art Culture Ideas. Shawn's research interests are in intersectionality, power dynamics, and identity. Following his career as a dancer and choreographer, he obtained a Ph.D. in cultural studies from Queen's University. And Jeanne LeSage is a highly respected senior arts management professional with 30 years plus years of experience of national, international festivals and multidisciplinary performing arts. She is a sought-after consultant with her practice LeSage Arts Management based in Toronto that provides counsel, solutions, and support to arts organizations in areas such as strategic human resources, organizational development, strategy, board development, and more. She's also an educator and conference speaker working across Canada with a unique specialization in arts HR and one of the co-founders of the Leadership Emergency Arts Network, which was known as LEAN. Jeanne has an MBA in executive management with a specialization in management consulting and a registered certified human resource leader. And our moderator, Owais Lightwala, is an arts leader and creative producer. He's currently assistant professor in the School of Performance at the Creative School at X University, where his teaching and research is focused on creative producing and arts management. Prior to that, he spent 8 years as the managing director for Why Not Theatre, helping lead and build a scrappy startup that has become one of Canada's leading cultural disruptors. He's completed business and leadership training from Harvard, Stanford, the TAC Leaders Lab, and the Civic Action Diversity Fellowship. He's also a board member himself, currently serving on the boards of TO Live, the Amy Project, and Art Ignite. So we'll get started in a moment. I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. Only the presenters and moderators will have our microphones on today, so please submit your questions in the Q&A box. In addition to his own questions, Owais will be pulling questions from the Q&A box throughout the discussion. So please submit your questions starting during the slide presentation and continually after that. The session is scheduled for 1 hour and 15 minutes. We are also happy to have ASL interpreters Savannah and Christopher from Toronto Sign Language Interpreter Service with us here today. Finally, I'd like to thank the Speaker Series presenting partner, Power Corporation of Canada, for your support in this important series, and to welcome Senior Vice President Paul Jeanne, who will give our closing remarks today. I also want to thank Manulife Financial as a supporting partner. I will now pass the microphone over to Jeanne and Shawn.
Great. Thank you so much, Aubrey. And I'm going to dive in. I'm going to share screen, and we're going to pause and have that moment when the screens, there we go, all over the place. So wonderful to be here. And I know we've got a lot to cover. And so I'm going to dive in. But first, if anybody's used one of these lovely mentees, and Karan, I'm not sure if you're able to put the link in chat, but you can use this lovely QR reader. We'd love to hear a little bit about who's here in the room. I would love to see all of your faces, but since there's a wonderful large group and we're not in the same room, you can work on this and answer the few questions that we've asked you, just so that we know who's in the room. And I'm going to hand this over a little bit. Just from myself and Shawn, a little bit about ourselves before we dive into the work. So for myself, my pronouns are she, her. And for an image description for myself, I'm a white middle-aged cis woman in my 50s with silver gray curly hair and glasses, and I'm wearing a brown jacket and gray scarf. I am a settler with family from England, Ireland, and France, and I'm now living and working in Takaranto. I'm grateful for the opportunity to work and live on this land. And Shawn, could you share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you. My name's Shawn, and I am a white male presenting man, uses he, him pronouns. I have red hair, purple glasses, and a teal shirt on. And I too am a settler subject descending from the UK and currently work and live in what is now commonly called Toronto.
Thank you. And as Aubrey mentioned, get those questions into the Q&A. This first part, we're going to present some info. You've got the report, lots of info there. We're going to try to distill that into a short piece and then get that Q&A, and Owais will engage with us later on. Shawn.
Great. So we have three sort of key goals for today, and that's really just to really kind of pull out what the main learnings were that built the governance pathways worksheet that Jeanne's going to go through later. She's going to give a high level overview, and then with the discussion that we're going to have with Owais, we want to really dive into more of the ideas and the issues that either come through in the report or that get missed. And key here, though, is this whole project is not intended to be a kind of definitive answer or solution for governance. It's really about pulling out the ideas that people have been struggling with, continue to struggle with, also learning from their successes and trying to put that together into something that we can continue to move forward with. So working towards those goals for today, we're doing this through Jeanne's going to summarize kind of some governance challenges that give a bit of context to how this project emerged. I'm going to go through then sort of what we heard through the sector survey that was shared. And then Jeanne's going to come back to going through the governance worksheet as a possible tool that we hope is useful to folks. And then Owais will come in and as we've been saying, give us a grilling in the spirit of supporting the work and really allowing us also to reflect on it and hopefully improve as we move forward with it. So Jeanne, I think next slide is good. One caveat, however, is that both Jeanne and I, advise that you seek legal and/or human resources expert advice as required, as each organization has its own specific needs, opportunities, and challenges. And actually, that's very central to what we will be talking about today. Is that kind of specificity that we hope this report helps everyone to understand. Jeanne, over to you.
Right. So again, this is part of an overall Future of Arts Work project. This paper itself, which is available on the Mass Culture site, is focused on board governance. And just as an intro, why the board governance piece? I mean, we all know, and again, there's lots more info in the report itself. You know, everything obviously changed in 2020, the seismic shifts, the COVID-19 lockdown, overnight shuttering of our sector, the reckoning of social justice issues. And this laid bare a lot of vulnerabilities, dysfunctions, and inequities in the sector. You know, some of them new, but a lot of them also happened before. And the conversation started across the country in many aspects of these changes, keeping the sector whole, navigating the relief resources, looking at those changes, staying connected with audiences, and looking at how are we going to really look at true systemic change. And so board governance was also one of these things that came up a lot in those conversations. And in some of the preparatory material, I've given you lots of examples of people that have already been bringing up this conversation. So Yvette Nolan has written a wonderful piece on the Mass Culture site about governance structures for theaters by theaters. ONN, Ontario Nonprofit Network, has an entire program called Reimagining Governance. Pacific Legal Education and Outreach, and I see there's already a link to a session they're having tomorrow. Pleo has been having roundtables on board disruption. Dream Rider Productions has been talking about their governance. Vule, who's a US blogger, nonprofit AF, which used to have a more salty title. Lots of these conversations are happening. So for this work, should we innovate our board structures? And included in this work today, the paper provides for you select secondary research pieces. There's so much out there in terms of governance. The examples of the current conversation, similar to the ones I've given you here, and results of a survey that we held with the sector earlier this year. And then again, trying to talk about, so then what? So what is governance? So not to worry, I'm not going to go too far down the what is governance. There's so many different theoretical aspects. Of course, I want to quote the ever wise and ever wonderful Jane Marsland. Governance is one of the most frequently used and least understood terms in use today. So what is it? So goals and roles of nonprofit boards across Canadian arts and culture. We see those notions of working boards, advisory boards, governance boards. And we see, and I want to say this first and foremost, with all of these types of boards, there's a wide range of volunteer directors who are tremendous leaders, tireless supporters, and champions of their organization sector. There are boards and board members doing really great work. But what we also know is that there are also boards that can be ineffective, which can be a drain on the organization's resources, and in the worst case scenario can be really counterproductive to the goals and the mission of the organization, even to the point of maybe creating toxic workplaces for staff and other board members. So what we were seeing in the voices and in the stories coming forward is that there's a real range in terms of the effectiveness of boards. So what is governance? I'm not going to walk through all of these, but in the research, there's lots of different frameworks about exactly what governance is. So framework of responsibilities, requirements, and accountabilities. A lot of the ONN's research focused focused more on what governance can be from a positive point of view. So is it setting organizational direction and policy, overseeing performance, setting mechanisms for decision-making, compliance, accountability. And Michael Kaiser frames the priorities of arts boards specific to effective arts organizations about org effectiveness, approving the strat plan, garnering resources, serving as ambassadors. There's lots and lots of definitions out there. One thing that I want to bring forward to frame discussion today is from the ONN's report, which was crafted by Lalonde, which is through the Mowat Center, is they have framed that there are two basic elements for not-for-profit governance. What is required by the legislative bodies, which could be CRA for the nonprofits that are charities, and then what's the applicable provincial, territorial, federal body for incorporated nonprofits. And then there's the rest, the larger component that is at the discretion of each organization. And this is a key message I want us to really talk about and think about today. So they further asserted that after number one, understanding what those legal requirements are, there's very limited direction on the board's purpose and structure as a whole in the legislation. And Robert's rules. And I think I saw something go by in the chat, like, are we supposed to use Robert's rules? This is one of Shawn's favorite topics. Robert's rules is not legislated as required. So, and again, I am not a bylaw governance lawyer, but we want to bring forward what the research said about what is legally required versus what is discretionary. So governance, another key message I want to bring forward is governance is not actually just about the board. And ONN's Reimagining Governance has really kind of put forward a view that governance is a shared and collaborative responsibility. And I think this is a really key piece for us to think about. It's a series of functions to be carried out by the organization, and the board is one part of the structure of that process. And Marsland also brings this up, that if governance is the art of steering your organization, it's a shared responsibility between the professional staff and the volunteer board, and should be seen as a journey and not a destination. So what are the challenges? So what brought about this conversation that we're having now? So, you know, there's lots of different conversations about what the challenges are. The challenges are, we've got low governance literacy, we've got and those folks that are maybe have a low arts sector literacy, they're the ones making decisions. There's lack of clarity about roles, and particularly around power and control. The problem solving might be focused on symptoms and not the root cause. There's an ongoing lack of diversity when it comes to representation on boards, and even governance itself not matching 21st century needs. Has it evolved? And what's the sustainability? We're getting a shortage of volunteer leaders, and there's some research to say that generationally, there may not be that same level of volunteers willing to step up. And Yvette Nolan has also laid out in that same blog post I mentioned about the challenges that they saw, which was about nonprofit boards being created after a corporate model, which is driven by profit and shareholders, instead of the focus being on artists, audiences, and communities. A concern that board members are not connected to the art, that there's a lack of clarity of roles, again, that comes up. And then looking at what is that continuity? If there's sort of turnover, if there's a change in those volunteer leaders, what does that mean for organizations? So what if we get this wrong? What is the impact and the consequences of ineffective governance? And what does that mean for organizations? I think we can see that there's an inordinate amount of staff resources, time, energy, and effort towards managing a board and possibly educating them about the sector and about governance itself. Not in all cases, but in many cases we heard that. There's a continued cycle of lack of diversity on boards. There can be, because of that concern about the liability, there can be that overemphasis on risk and liability in that decision-making. And then in all of this, then you could very well have disengagement and burnout for effective board members. You have a cycle of succession challenges for new board members and that disruption of operations. All of this is going to impact the organization, could have a reputational impact, and ultimately it affects the organization trying to meet the needs of the beneficiaries and, you know, serving the mission of the organization. So that's a super, super quick overview about if what we are talking about, what governance is, what the challenges are, what the conversations are of late. And then I'm going to hand this over to Shawn to talk about what next in this report and in this research. Shawn.
I'm starting my video. Here we go. Okay, so as Jeanne said, the survey responses really yielded a lot of ideas, and sometimes they were competing, sometimes they were in tandem with each other. So if you just go to the next slide, please, Jeanne. The way that we organized this, rather than in the report than give a question by question summary, we created three different sort of categories that allowed us to trace the kind of themes and organize the responses by the data that they provided. So the first being the business of the board. So there were lots of different opinions about and perspectives and experiences on what the business of a board is. So we wanted to bring this together and explore some options. So this was also key in that there was such a diverse array of opinions and current practices, because it really demonstrated to us this idea that one size fits one, right? That there isn't one model that will work for every kind of organization. There are different ways that we might think of models as being more appropriate for some types of organizations than others. We can look at it from the disciplinary practice. We can look at it from the geographic location. So all is to say that in this section, we also kind of look at things like board of performance evaluation, even that was an idea that was thrown out, training and education for boards, what some are the pros and cons, whether that seemed to hold water for people, and also accountability. And, you know, that I think has been a recurring theme throughout the sector, you know, for many years. One key thing that we're not really going to talk about today, but it is a pretty, I think, provocative idea, is this tension between board volunteerism as potentially, in some instances, a form of labor exploitation. And so this was raised by a few respondents. And so we wanted to give a bit of space to sort of think about that and reflect on that. The next section was what we're calling the Great Disconnect, and Jeanne has sort of, you know, mentioned it already, but the disconnection between what is legally required of a board and what a board what is needed for the board to do in service of the organization, and trying to align the purpose of board governance and in a way that supports the mission, the mandate, and the values of the organization. Here, you know, we explored some ideas around managing the leadership of an organization and that dynamic between leadership and the board. And also there was a difference of opinion and experience around whether or not boards should be left to big picture issues and thinking and strategizing, or if they are actually given specific tasks. And, you know, there are many different practices that include board committees and that kind of thing. But again, what we saw occasionally was assumptions that there are specific legal requirements that just aren't there. Another thing that sort of takes us into the next section is this idea of community. And, you know, as we were working through the responses, we saw the word community used a lot, but it was, you know, difficult to discern what community meant to particular organizations. And, you know, we can see this in the ways that when the board speaks of the community and the staff speaks of community, are they speaking about the same group of people? And really clarifying that community is important. This also ties into diversity and representation within boards and within the organization as a whole. And there were calls for a greater representation of different communities. And so really being articulate, you know, around defining community is a key piece. One of the things we also explore, though, in this section is really building off of the work of Sarah Ahmed, who has done work on racism and diversity in post-secondary settings. And this is where we get into kind of questioning this current system, is how that system was historically built. And simply having diversity does not mean inclusion, because how do you engage with a system that was built by a particular group of people and through particular ways of knowing? And so we try to bring that in to the report to think about, okay, we are questioning governance and what it is and how organizations engage in it. And so we're introducing, jumping off of respondents, this idea of really crafting, again, a kind of one size fits one model. So, and on that note, in relation to board culture and power dynamics, and for me, this is a really important piece, is we speak about sort of expertise in the board composition. And, you know, having lawyers, having accountants, that can be a good practice. We also want to think about lived experience as a form of expertise, right? Experiences of marginalization and experiences of exclusion craft and create a kind of expertise. And we need to really think about how we value equally or even greater value those kinds of expertise as well. So in a very small nutshell, that's kind of a lot of what we heard in the major tenets for crafting the tool that Jeanne's going to go over in a minute. But before we get to that, Jeanne, the next slide, please. And so what? So we heard all of these things and we did this analytical work and we wrote this report. And again, we are coming back to the need for an individually crafted governance system and processes and practices that fit your organization and the needs of the organization, and deriving that system based out of the mission and the values of the organization. We also heard from respondents that maybe the timing isn't right for innovation. We thought that there were lots of people who felt that we have underexplored possibilities and potentials within governance. And again, as I've sort of alluded to, needing more critical engagement with the idea of governance or governance as a concept, specifically through anti-racist, decolonial, and other modes of analysis. And Jeanne, I think I'm going to call you back.
Okay. So how can we be sure this isn't just another lovely report? And listen, I'm conscious of wanting to follow a rigor of research and a rigor of analysis. And I think what was interesting, as Shawn was saying, we were really looking for innovation, but we kind of kept getting with the wheels stuck about, well, no, let's talk about how it is now. And some people really were like, you know what, we don't need to innovate governance. Some people were very strongly were like, no, we need to innovate this. But so what do we do with this? And so I go from the researcher in me to the practitioner and consultant in me. And I wanted to kind of now come forward to say, well, so what can we do here? And what you'll see in the report is I'm calling it a pathway. It's a potential tool for organizations to start to really look at, okay, how do we design this governance? If it is one size fits one, if it really is looking at what do we need for our organization, but knowing that we are so resource scarce, how can we together as a sector start to look at some models that might work together? I was looking at trying to create a bit of a workbook or a pathway or a tool for organizations maybe to sit down to do it. Now, as I often say with a lot of these processes, the tool itself can be useful to sit down and create an outcome. But I believe the process of creating this tool together, that shared collaborative governance, I think is as powerful as the resulting document or tools. This is a preliminary idea. We're throwing it out there. What we would love, and now we'll tee this up for some later work, we would love some organizations to take this, try it out, and come back and say, no, the tool does not work, or yes, we like it, or here's how we would change it. So what is this? So we're calling it the teal appeal, mainly because of the color. It was the aubergine dream for a little while, and now it's the teal appeal. So what is it? Back to that sense of that governance. What is the definition of governance? What do we need legally? And I'm seeing some pieces in the chat about, well, here's actually what's legal and required in our province. That's amazing. And this is where you need to kind of look for your own jurisdiction about what you need to do for governance according to your organization. So if you think about the darker shades going down to the lighter shades, I've done 4 buckets. And these are areas in governance that you really need to sit down and look at, what does your organization need? So the first one, and the teal, the darker teal, here's the mandatory items. So if you're a charitable nonprofit, you need to understand your own CRA mandated requirements. Then you are going to have your own provincial, territorial, or if you are a federal organization, nonprofit requirements. And then you've obviously got some legal and legislative compliance above that. So yes, organizations, pretty much all organizations are going to need to hit that first band. Then next level down, I'm framing this bucket as a duty of care. So this could be your own values. This could be equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-racism, anti-oppression, can be respectful workplaces, countering with code of conducts and workplace harassment. It could be community accountability. The next bucket, strong organizational oversight. So you are running a business. So that can start from that strategy of the mission, vision, mandate, the organizational strategy and direction, then therefore, what are the resources, the budget, the financial oversight, and then managing the reports of the board. So those 2, whether it's 1 or 2 leaders that report up to the board, and then managing the board itself. And then the fourth bucket is, this is where it's like the discretionary priority part. In every organization, at some point, maybe you're in the middle of a capital campaign. Maybe audience development is the piece that you're working on. Maybe it's looking at community outreach, marketing. These are the discretionary pieces. So the idea being that for each of these buckets, if you sort of sit down and go, okay, shared collaborative governance, here's our first bucket. Now let's look at some of those potential mechanisms. And this is going to be change also from the size of your organization, the structure, the complexity, the community you're in, but really sitting down together to go, if this is our first bucket, which is mandatory, what are those instruments we need to do? And who's going to do them? Who's going to take the lead? And we can look at this all the way through those four buckets of the mandatory, the duty of care, the strong organizational oversight, and discretionary priorities. And with organizations, sometimes, we might kind of jump to, well, let's look at our board composition. Let's look at a skills matrix. Let's look at committee structure. And for me, I go back to what does your organization need? What are the goals of your organization, the mission, the structure? And looking at this worksheet might just be a way, and it might not work for everyone, just to sit down and to try to really mindfully look at what is it that we need. So just something to kind of throw at you. So just to kind of pull it in before we open it up for questions, and I'll Owais, this is your 2-minute warning. As we've both mentioned, the initial goal of this was to look for systemic innovation and governance. And I think a couple key things that we saw is that from the survey and from the research, people are struggling with managing governance. We are seeing this come out, and we're hearing this throughout the sector. And it is difficult to say if we need to abandon the system, as some voices have said. Do we need to modify the system, or do we need to educate ourselves better on what the system is? And even if it is one size fits one, and as I think what you're hearing from us is it does need to be catered for your organization. But is there more that we can do together as a sector to look at that systemic change? And that teal appeal is just a tool. It might be the right one, it might be the wrong one. But again, for me, have the conversation, shape your governance, do that collaborative work according to the needs and mission of your organization. And I will leave that there. Lots more information on the Mass Culture website. And I think some links are going into the chat about where to find all these pieces. But I'm going to ask Owais to step up. And maybe what we can do is, if you haven't done your Menti yet, you can still have some time. We'd love to kind of see who's in the room. But Owais, there we are. Hi, Owais, welcome. So great to see you.
Hi, good afternoon.
Shall we look at the results for our Menti?
Yes, please.
Great. So I'm just going to go back to the slides. Oh, we don't have any results here. That's all right.
This might happen.
Oh, there we go. We've got one. There we go. Well, that's all right. So we'll move on. Okay.
There's no one here.
There's no one here. Oh, we've got
Can't get past the first slide. They couldn't see the questions.
Oh, okay. Well, there we go. We gave it a try. Well, I'm going to thanks for those that tried, and stuff is now coming in. So that's great.
It was a noble idea.
Here we go. The bubbles are coming in, but I'm going to stop share, and Owais, I'm going to hand you the microphone.
Please do fill out the questions if you can in the Menti, for those of you who are still with us. It is helpful to me, at least, just to satisfy my curiosity. Thank you, Jeanne and Shawn, for that really condensed summary, because it is a much longer report than what you guys managed to condense it down to, and there's a lot in there to unpack. I feel like where we got to by the end of that, for me at least, is quite tactical in terms of the teal appeal, and the place this whole conversation started was systemic innovation. So I want to take a step back and actually go back to the systems question here, which one of the things I think about a lot when whenever anyone says innovation is, we rush always to add new things. And in the responses and some of the feedback you got in the survey, I saw a whole bunch of mention of like more training, more this, more money, more that. And is there room to talk about doing less? What about innovation where we're not doing as much? And some of the things that stood out to me is that 90% of your 100 respondents were pretty small organizations that had budgets less than $2 million. And I have often wondered if we are doing too much governance. So this is my provocative question for you. Is there actually a crisis of too much governance, not that the governance and the boards is the problem? And what you would say to that? Because in the business world, in the for-profit world, the majority of companies that are public in the way that we expect nonprofits and charities to behave are large corporations. Like they have massive amounts of revenue and systems. And for smaller businesses, it's just expected that they don't need to be governed in the same way or have the same structures. But yet, for some reason, we fixate in our sector in the arts on this really intense amount of accountability, in addition to funder accountability, donor accountability, community accountability, audits, annual reports. We have a lot going on already. So first provocative question is, what if we just did away with all this governance? Do we need it?
Shawn, you go first.
Well, this was some of the responses, spoke to this and this idea that already in the nonprofit sector, with current granting reporting practices and filings to the CRA, that there are already mechanisms in place that, we know that those systems can create redundancies, right? That people are having to file multiple reports to different agencies and different sources of revenue. And when really, if, there were calls for a more centralized kind of system or even an organization. So yes, my perception based on these responses is that we can't actually say yes or no, because again, it has to be, what does your organization need? If you are a small organization and you are a presenter, say, and maybe your board members need to come and, run coat check. Maybe they need to be really involved in the day-to-day runnings. If you are a super large organization, maybe you don't need that, because there is a staff that actually do the running of the organization. I think that one of the key things to think about with governance is that, again, trying to move away from the idea that only the board is involved in governance, and rather how can that become a value and a modus operandi for everyone in the organization, and understand that they are part of governing the organization.
Yeah, I think, and I'm gonna meta up a bit more, which is, do we need to have nonprofits? And I think, Owais, you and I have had a few.
You stole my question. That was going to be the next thing.
I'm sorry. Well, because you and I have had several coffees, virtual and in the before times, and now a cat's walking by. The need for the nonprofits is a question that I have, and I understand that we're in it now. It's like, well, if we need this for funding, and then that's the cycle, then we start an organization because we have an idea or a mission or an artistic drive, and then we need to have a board, et cetera, et cetera. And I know that the work, and again, the work with the Riser project and Jane Marsland, again, looking at maybe CVOs and charitable venture organizations. And yes, we've got some limitations with CRA, but again, that goes back to the innovation. Like, it might mean that the innovation needs to be large scale, as opposed to trying to make some smaller adjustments. So that for me is the first thing, is, do we need to have all of these nonprofits? She's been asleep all day and now she needs some attention. So then I do think, because of a scarcity of time and resources for the entire sector, for everything we do, we replicate and we DIY. We replicate and DIY, we replicate and DIY. And I think we're seeing that after lockdown, about even that conversation about, how is our resilience? How is our capacity? Can we continue at this rate anyway? Let alone, can we put efforts towards things that are really, do we need to do them? So I do agree, because some organizations are doing governance very, very well, and it's the right thing for that organization. And I do think there needs to be a real examination of what does that governance need to be.
And so in that vein of thinking about nonprofits, where is that coming from? When did we decide collectively as a sector that the only appropriate model for arts organizations had to be nonprofit charitable entities, which we share with hospitals and universities and charities? When did we decide that? Where was that referendum held?
Go ahead, Shawn.
I say we hire a historian and we task them with uncovering that. I mean, there is the history of different kinds of granting agencies, right? And there are plenty of people who have spoken about not just the arts, but how nonprofits in any sector exist to address a gap that governments and for-profits do not. But what we also are seeing, right, are models that are more integrated, that are not so discreetly organized. But also what happens is that those organizations struggle because they aren't legible to the systems that exist, right? And so Jeanne?
Yes, okay. So I think then that goes sort of back to this was created and therefore this and therefore this and therefore this, and a number of things have changed, but we're still reflecting this. And so it is a good question as to whether or not, and Shawn, you were mentioning this, because it's one of the questions that we asked in the survey, which was if we didn't have nonprofit, what do you think about that? And a lot of the concerns were about the accountability, but there's lots of accountability in reporting when there's public funds, XYZ. So I think it just has to go back to, can we look at a model that does have that level of public accountability? And I know CRA is a whole different conversation about charitable tax receipts, et cetera. But maybe it would be a question to talk to funders about, to kind of say, is there a world for them where they can have the same kind of accountability and rigor that would be needed to account for that, for the public need? Is there another way around that? Now, the question is would we be having another webinar in 3 years about this new business entity is not working, why not? And let's do governance. So we would want to not just replicate the same challenges in a new model. That would be the other thing.
So to that end, how much of what you saw in the responses and the survey and kind of the research you've been doing, how much can you correlate with resource scarcity and chronic systemic underfunding versus actual structural issues in the governance? Is it the case that if we funded this whole endeavor much better, we would stop having these conversations about why everything feels so hard all the time?
A couple of things. I'm going to maybe jump and forth. I'm going to jump and forth between specifics and maybe more conceptual. The concept of having expertise on your board, and I know, for example, it's good to have a lawyer, it's good to have an accountant, et cetera, et cetera. And there's lots of good conversations that came in on the survey. A lot of the work that Pleo was doing and the work Martha Rands was saying is, and Martha will say clearly, like, if you need a lawyer, pay for a lawyer. If you need expertise, pay for an expertise. And I saw this mentioned in the chat to say those kinds of levels of expertise are expensive. And I don't disagree with having those thinkers on the board, but it's a difference between, and this is, I'm using Martha's terms, and I'm not sure if she's on the call, but she's saying, if you have a lawyer, it's not to give you legal advice, it's to give you legal thinking and legal strategy and a legal approach to things only as needed by your organization. So I think the scarcity comes into play. And this is where, if I don't think we had enough respondents, because we had 101 respondents, to correlate what were the differences between the size of organization. Because if you had a size of organization where you've got an ED, AD, and then maybe directors of, then you've got a good pool of lots of staff. And then, so your board can be a governance board, it can be an advisory board. But if you do have a staff of one, then sometimes your board does need to kind of fill in. So sorry, feel like somebody needs to pull me back. So I think I'm going down a rabbit hole. But I think that scarcity is about that perception about that expertise. It's also about the really good movement that happened in terms of board members being involved in fundraising. And so does that mean they need to be on the fiduciary board? And that's where you see Voulet's blog post, which was about have a minimally viable board and then have an integrity board, so that the integrity board is actually more about that community representation, and the minimally viable board can be about looking at the pieces that are about the governance. Now, some folks very rightly respond in the surveys like, now I got 2 boards to manage. No, thank you. Like, so I get it. Like, it's really challenging kind of to find the right balance.
I think too, sorry, just always because nonprofit organizations receive so many different, there are so many different revenue streams that come perhaps through granting from councils or foundations, or through donors, through corporate sponsorships. All of those have different expectations, different exclusions, and it can be very difficult to figure out how to pay for those services. And so it's not sometimes necessarily like, yes, I'm never going to say that that we shouldn't put more money into the arts, but trying to navigate if you've got all of these pockets of money coming in, and this one can't pay for that, and that one can't pay for that, and this is only a project, and this is it is a kind of the kind of accounting that has to happen, and then in response the reporting is intense. And rather than a revenue and a system saying, well, what do you need to do with this money? Right? I mean, we are focused on wanting to get art out into the public, and that's a really great, good thing. We also need to think about the other parts of operating, as Jeanne said, a business. And there are costs that come with that. And we, as a sector, because we are largely nonprofit, need to really kind of engage with that question, and I think push forward with making, allowing money to be spent as it needs to be.
And there is lots of precedent for this, like Canada Council's Digital Strategy Fund was given out several $100,000 grants to individuals and collectives who were not incorporated under any legal structure. And all they were asked was put forward a accountability framework for your project, whatever is appropriate for what you're doing. And in a lot of cases, I know for a fact that the grants they were giving out with digital strategy were sometimes bigger than operating funding that a lot of companies are getting right now. So it is inside the realm of our current legal frameworks to clearly do things that are more outside of, because someone asked in the chat, if not nonprofit, what else? Can you put a name on that? And I think, the fact that we are so limited by this paradigm is one of the barriers to having a really interesting discussion, because we start and end within the confines of the paradigm. I don't know what a completely new business structure would be, but let's say we called it a social enterprise model or something that was a new type of organizational designation under the CRA that was allowed to give tax receipts, but in every other way was a for-profit business and paid taxes maybe on profits. Like we could potentially brainstorm an idea that I didn't hear that in your responses. Is there something about the limits of our paradigm that is limiting the conversation right now?
I think that the limits, I mean, I think this is where it's interesting, and now I'm sort of still going back to the sort of the scarcity. It's possible that for folks that are in it, the thought of innovation, like, folks are pretty taxed, like the capacity is pretty maxed out. So the thought of innovating may be of interest, but it may also just be it's so tough. We're so sorry, I'm stumbling a little bit on my words, but things are tough. Like people are at capacity. They were prior to the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And so the thought of innovating might be super tough. I think it would be interesting to look to, the new emerging orgs and maybe orgs of a certain size coming in. And I, again, go back to, I don't think we should say what the business entity should be. I think the business mm-hmm. entity should match the needs of the organization. And so even for us to say it should be a B Corp, I'm not sure that we should say that.
in terms of also hearing from respondents, like the timing of this survey is really, the context in which we were asking people is really important, because as we well know, the arts were the hardest hit sector with the pandemic, performing arts organizations, even particularly so, and they were still trying to navigate whether or not they could qualify for wage subsidies or rent subsidies or when that would end. And so asking people to think about innovation when they go, I don't even know like how to work the current new sudden system, it needs to be taken into account. But I also think that again, what the pandemic has revealed in a lot of sectors are the limitations. And many people, Owais, you being one of them, knew about those limitations long before the pandemic, and we're working to change those. And we've just seen now those who were able to navigate within them going, actually, the system didn't support, right? The system was itself restrictive to the survival of many organizations, and still, many are still at risk.
Yeah,
and artists. I mean, artists. I don't have a full sentence there, but I'm like, again, back to the art, back to the artists. End of thought. Always.
Yeah, do you think this is a conversation? There's been some references to director training for nonprofits and the suitability or unsuitability rather of that to the arts context. Do you feel like this is the same conversation? That's because it's interesting, the ONN kind of research is much broader in terms of the constituents that they represent, but do you think this is the same conversation happening in the nonprofit charities? Like, are hospitals getting together and being like, oh, what are we going to do about our boards, and our universities having this conversation? Are the kind of anti-poverty reduction charities in the same boat, or is this something to do with the nature of arts and culture being either unique in the taxation that people are feeling, the emergency that they're feeling, or unique in the way that this industry works?
I think the arts often, like for many years, our sort of way of thinking is like, please, we'll take whatever you give us, instead of actually being more assertive and saying, look at all of the things that we can, that the arts actually do, and actually, how the arts are beneficial. And I don't want to be solely focusing on, we only invest in arts because it allows us to achieve other things, but that's still a really important component. And, we're seeing, to use your hospital context, like we're starting to see more of this kind of the lessening of these divides between sectors, right? We're seeing more, say, arts engaged or arts as a mode of healthcare, right? And calls for that. And so I think that as these sectors start to be a little bit less mutually exclusive, we're going to have to think about how the sector systems kind of reflect and enable that kind of collegiality, I guess. I think I went really off topic.
I think it's certainly, as the ONN research, the Ontario Nonprofit Network Reimagining Governance, as I've referenced, and I know, I believe there's been some examination in other jurisdictions as well. I think folks are thinking about it. I think maybe if we sort of think about mission vision point of view from arts organizations, I sort of go back to, a person's an artist, they want to put on their art. If they want to get funding, they have to form a nonprofit. That's an oversimplification, because of course there are individual artists who get grants, but if they want to do it in any kind of a larger scale, or you want to hire people or become an employer or an organization, that has been the model for some, right or wrong. So, and then we sort of have, I feel like then there's the mission and the vision, and then there's the artistic vision, and where I know, and this is not my realm, and I know there's lots of great conversations happening in the sector about impact and things like that. It might be a little bit different from nonprofit, because nonprofit will tend to be the mission that's serving a community. And for us, who we serve, is a wonderful array of different things. Yes, it's who we serve. It's also the artists, it's also the art form, it's also cities, it's also, so I'd like to offer that there's a beautiful reason why it's more complicated for us. It's just so darn hard.
Mm-hmm. And with that complication, we haven't helped ourselves either by releasing any of the pressure on ourselves. It sounds like we've really embraced the desire to do it more and more complexity to try and solve more and more of the challenges and needs. And that's only increasing. There's all kinds of questions in the chats about like different kinds of oppression, different kinds of dynamics of power. And I don't want to get into the tactical conversations about how you manage the power dynamics in individual boards, because we don't have 6 years. But with the 10 minutes that we have, how much of this is also a leadership crisis in our society at large, and related to what we're seeing in a lot of other parts of society, which is a kind of major re-interrogating, questioning of institutions, of what the roles of institutions are, of how we understand the organizing of power in institutions, because really boards are associated with institutions and the idea of governance of an institutional entity. And in this conversation, there's kind of like an elephant somewhere in the room, which is all the artistic and executive leadership that's also been in crisis in a lot of ways simultaneously as the kind of we've seen all these board crises. It's been a two-handed clap. So do you see any relationship between a larger question of leadership and institutions and power in our world? That's a big question. I realize how big I just lobbed at you, but you can handle it.
Owais, what do you think?
I mean, I'm asking it because I think there might be something there, but I'm interested in whether you see that as a possible, are we just a microcosm reflecting this much larger reality?
Well, I think that partly, what I was sort of kind of getting at earlier in talking about some of the results from the survey is that the system was built by and for particular groups of people. Mm-hmm. And I was so excited that the first question in the chat was Robert's Rules, because as Jeanne points out, it's one of my favorite things to talk about, because I think various processes and systems become normalized because they just get adopted. You're for a board, as a board member, you're the first board you sit on uses Robert's Rules, and so you wouldn't maybe have any other context to know that there are other ways out there. But also, and we very briefly in the report, point to the fact that Robert's Rules, first of all, is not even a Canadian source. It's derived out of US Congress, but therefore it was also built by a colonial system and a colonial government. And so it's not to say that there aren't good and useful components to Robert's Rules. But I think what we also were hearing from respondents is, again, this real alignment of values of the organization. And if you value, anti-racism, if you want to engage in decolonization, you have to think about the tools and the systems that you are already using or that you've inherited, and really reflect on how did you come to use these things. Have other options been explored? Have you engaged in that work to understand the legacy of the socio-political context that we're in? And we're seeing so many calls throughout the sector for engagement in all kinds of anti-oppression, and those are really important. There have been really important gains. As I'm a white man, but I'm queer and I am disabled, and I have seen some really wonderful things. But we need to go back and really understand how these things came into being in the first place. Rant done.
Thank you. I love the ranting because I feel like we're getting to something that is a bit more going to that space of what if we were to really talk about imagining you, because I think the call that I'm hearing from this report and from you two to the arts organizations and to the leaders in our community is, we know you're tired, you have been through a lot, but we can't be just reactive and in emergency mode. At some point, we're gonna have to deal with this thing. I'm hearing a call to the funding institutions and systems to go, help us out here. We can't do this on our own. And a lot of this is frankly your fault. So like, let's work together, because some of these systems are in place because we're responding to you, or at least that's what the perception is. What is your kind of call, or what do you think the message is to board members? Because this is business in the arts. And I feel like half this 321 attendee audience is just people who are like, oh man, this is terrifying. I don't know if I should join a board anymore, because I don't want to make anybody's life worse. It sounds like a terrible thing for me to be on their board right now.
No, and thank you for that. And I think this is where you heard me say earlier, want to be super clear that there are board members who are champions, who are tireless, who give their expertise, including a lot of our members here. And I'm looking at the Menti, and thank you. We've got about 198 folks that have contributed on the Menti, and we've got 93 board members, 91 leaders of arts organizations, staff members, artists, consultants. And I do think, one of the pieces of research that actually another one that came out of ONN was they did a research with, it was a generational board leadership. And there's a real concern that there's might be a shift that people are not going to be willing to volunteer. They're not going to be willing to step up. Plus we're saying all these lovely things about how hard everything is, right? So I agree. And I think maybe, and it's not, this is the Gen X are kind of going, okay, maybe I'll just wait for somebody else to figure it out. And this is where you're seeing, like, we're talking conceptual, and then I come up with a teal appeal, which is a really practical, even though I'm saying we should innovate. And then I'm like, okay, but if we want to fix it, let's fill in a chart, because Jeanne likes charts and making things that are teal and aubergine. So I think it's having the courage to kind of say, let's innovate. And it is tough, because what is the terminology about, you're trying to fly the plane. So, we're flying the plane and we're trying to replace the wings. So I'm not sure. I think I look to folks that are braver than I and probably more innovative than I, because I do kind of get into this, like, okay, let's figure this out, 1, 2, 3. And we know that those shortcuts, when we do those shortcuts, we miss the innovation. We also miss a whole layer of inclusion, and a lot of what both of you have been talking about. And we just replicate. We just keep replicating. So I might look to folks that are less of a linear stage manager brain than mine to maybe kind of take from this to go, well, this is what we should take. This is what we don't need to do, and let's create something new, and really kind of like look forward. I actually just saw something in the comments saying, maybe there's a need to bust through the fear. So I love that, like just kind of really looking at things. And so maybe for for board members, and again, it's going to be different because some boards, they are there at the either the performances or in the gallery, and they are working and they are contributing to the organization in a very different way from some of the larger boards that they may be more, ambassadors, connections, et cetera, et cetera. So really for boards to kind of ask the question, if you're asked to join an organization's board or you're in an organization's board, ask the questions about governance. Really ask those things about what do we need, and be mindful about what that role can be, and what maybe it's time to kind of say, can we step back and look at what it might need to be? Even now I'm saying that's within the current system.
I was going to say, question everything, and not in a way that is like, oh, if they don't know, then I'm not going to join that board. But that's an opportunity to participate then in that recovery of knowledge and history. I totally lost my train of thought. It was so good too.
It's that kind of day. I feel like it's the sun or something. But I've lost my train of thought a few times too. We'll wait with you, Shawn. I can see it's right there. No?
I'll write it down next time so I don't.
I'm going to show the Menti while that happens. Here, look, here's some pictures. There you go. So this is interesting. Here's who's in the room. And now folks could do multi-responses. So in a lot of cases, folks might have served several roles. Oh, there we go. It's moving around. So artists, board members, leaders of arts organizations, staff members of arts organizations, consultant advisors, educators, funders, others. And I think that's the one where we've got the most responses to was about folks' roles. So we've got, but a lot of folks here are arts organizations, ASOs, couple funders, community arts, government. There you go.
It looks to me like looking at that dotmocracy that like there's a lot of people here who are like, I feel like I can do better at this. I want to do better. I can take time out of my day to go learn about this thing that's going to help me do this thing better. And there's two kind of challenges. One is doing anything requires more work potentially. And like the last thing anybody wants to do is more work right now. And then the other challenge is like, do we respond to what we have and the limits of what we have, or do we kind of try and engage in this much larger systemic thing, which for most people is completely inaccessible. Like for most people, the idea of saying we're going to propose an entirely new type of business structure to the Canadian government is like not even a thing that is at all on their radar of possibilities. For those of you who have that kind of possibility, the like educators and the funders and the policymakers and the leaders of associations, I think there might be something to look at here, which is maybe someone needs to lead this coordination of this effort of a movement that needs to happen. And meanwhile, going back to the teal appeal, it feels like that's a good emergency tool for within the world we're in right now. How can we do things in a way that's a little bit more structured, a little bit clearer, with not really predetermining what outcomes, because we don't know what's going to be best for individual organizations and their challenges.
I remember what I was going to say, and I've come
Great.
up with a second thing. So it actually kind of looped back to your question, Owais, around earlier, do we need more governance, less governance? I mean, if we're standing here saying, you know, you need to question everything, how much questioning can you do with the board that meets 4 or 5 times a year? And how much opportunity is there, you know, and some boards meet far more frequently. You know, there is a huge array of practices around gathering, but really thinking about, is there time built into the board convenings to actually ask these questions in a meaningful way and engage in the work, right? Consider, and kind of thinking about what you were just speaking about. And, you know, I've having been an artist, then gone through academia, you know, when I returned to the sector out and left academia, even though I still have a love for it, I was really, as a researcher, quite floored with how, with the sector, generally speaking, there are definitely pockets of really forward-looking thinking, but the sector understands research in a very narrowly defined way. And it's surprising to me, given that it's the arts sector, right, that relies solely on social science and economics to actually demonstrate the work that we do. And I'm getting kind of tangential here, but I think that being able to bridge that gap between academia and the sector, and academia historically is extractive, it is historically oppressive in many ways, but there's an opportunity to reverse that. And there are so many ways of understanding power dynamics that are actually years ahead in academia in some of the research that happens that the sector really can learn from. And if there are other academics here today, I implore you to, you know, share your work and you know, beyond the peer-reviewed journals that live in the ivory tower. You know, we really need to engage with, you know, people who are able to. There is a benefit at times to working with people outside the sector, to again come back to an earlier question of yours, Owais, because they ask different questions. They have different understandings of practice and terminology. And that's my second rant for the day.
Okay, unfortunately, we could have done this for hours, I'm sure, but it is time for our part to wrap up. And the last thing I'll just say before handing off to our esteemed host, Paul, will be, I feel like this has been, for me, similar to a lot of conversations that I've had with Jeanne and Shawn and people that I work with, where we get really fired up about the problem and then just stop short of actually going, okay, let's like get some whiteboards and markers and like get at it And I want to put out a call to everybody here that if anybody wants to organize a hackathon, and like looking at the chat, I'm like, there's like 16,000 solutions posted, but we didn't really get into them because of the nature of this conversation. But I'm like, that's what I'm craving next is like, let's all get together in a room with masks on in for 2 days and like, let's actually develop 16 different models, because doing this work individually at every single organization is also a bit inefficient, and kind of part of the thing that we're responding to is like, you don't all need to reinvent the wheel on your own. Let's see if we can work together. So I'll put that out as my last call to everybody. And thank you, Jeanne and Shawn, for your work on this and for sitting through this grill session. You did really well. And over to you, Paul, for your final words.
Thank you, Owais. Bonjour à tous. Au nom de Power Corporation, je tiens à remercier tous les gens impliqués dans une discussion passionnante et constructive. Wow, what a conversation we have just witnessed. Let me also offer up a big thank you to our ASL interpreters, Savannah and Christopher, who've been doing yo woman and man service and done just an incredible job. So thank you. Look, it's got to be said, these have been incredibly tough times during the pandemic for arts and culture organizations in Canada, and obviously not just financially. Really, the stresses of this time have laid bare our inherent challenges in governance, staffing, inclusiveness in regards to artists. I've got to say, as a member of the board of Business and Arts, I'm really proud that Aubrey and her great team have been able to convene all these incredibly useful discussions within the sector. I really strongly believe it's going to help the arts in Canada move forward thoughtfully on systemic change for the betterment of workers. As Jeanne said, artists, and I think the artistic discourse in Canada and our organizations as a whole. A big thank you to Mass Culture for conducting this excellent research and for sharing with us these findings. Wow, rigorous, rich, thoughtful, provocative. Jeanne and Shawn, outstanding job. I serve on a number of other boards of directors in addition to business and the arts, and I see a lot of takeaways regarding strengthening and deepening practices and reflections on this. I also note as a donor a commentary about the burdens that can be placed on organizations when one tries to micro-target or target things and create additional pressures on organizations. So those comments are appreciated as well. Thanks as well to our superb moderator, Owais. Your questions were fantastic, and you were effectively a panelist. So maybe we have you back again to expand on some of, I think, the excellent ideas you were putting out there. Fabulous job. Many thanks as well to you, our audience, for being here and the provocative comments and questions and sometimes enthusiastic cheers and sometimes, impatience with getting on with that whiteboarding session. So I think that's absorbed and heard. Look, I got to say, just on behalf of Power Corporation, we're really pleased to be the presenting sponsor for this speaker series in 2021, which I think there have been similarly useful sessions through the course of the year. So it's a privilege to help bring these conversations to the fore. As Aubrey did, let me also give a shout out to our friends at Manulife Financial, who are the supporting partners for the series. And finally, if I may, as a board member, please don't forget that Business and the Arts is accepting nominations for the 2022 Business and Arts Awards until December 10th, 2021. So if your organization has partnered with a company to deliver an innovative program, or if you know a young professional who's demonstrated exemplary volunteer leadership, please don't be shy, step forward. You can nominate yourself. Line up some friends as well and some good letters, but that is absolutely welcome. You can join the likes of RBC, Green Thumb Theatre, Vibe Arts, Artscape, and many more whose exceptional dedication has been recognized. Visit the website to learn more about the awards program and how to nominate a champion. Also, please follow us on social media for future announcements of Business in the Arts. Alors, à la fin, un grand merci et restez tous en sécurité. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe. À la prochaine.